Hello and welcome to this Peterborough Climate Debate. Thank you for joining us. This workshop is an opportunity to learn a little bit about climate change, what we need to achieve in Peterborough, and have a think about some of the options for how the city may decarbonise. We'll be asking for your views on how the city should lower its emissions via an online form introduced at the end of the workshop. If you're taking this workshop with other people, there will also be opportunities to pause the video and discuss your thoughts. We'll use the insight gathered from this exercise to inform the way we develop our citywide climate change action plan. And we'll also release a report to share what we learn to make sure that other organisations can consider this in their decarbonisation plans. Councillor Soresti, our Cabinet Member for Climate Change, is going to give us a quick introduction as to why the Council sees this work as so important.
Welcome to today's Peterborough Climate Debate. The Council has committed to supporting Peterborough to become a net zero carbon city. And to achieve this, we will all need to play our part. This means that every resident, every business, every organisation, every community group and every school will need to make changes to the way they live, work, operate and play. To ensure we have the highest chance of meeting the city's ambitious target of becoming a net zero carbon place, we need to make sure that our city's future is supported by the people of Peterborough. There are many different pathways we could go down to reduce emissions from our buildings, from transport, our energy use, purchases, waste and land use. So it's vital we understand what these could look like and what would we be supported in our city. Your feedback will be crucial as we develop a citywide plan which would outline the pathway to net zero in future years. So I'd like to say a big thank you for giving up your time to take part in this, and I would ask you to share your experiences with friends, family and colleagues, and to encourage them to take part in future conversations around climate change. Tackling climate change and reducing carbon emissions is down to every single one of us, and so we hope that others around the city will use the insight developed in these debates to shape their future plans too. So let's get down to business and let's talk as to how Peterborough becomes net zero carbon city. Thank you.
We're going to start today with an introduction to climate change. Climate change is the long-term shift in average weather patterns across the world. Climate differs from weather in its time span. So weather is usually measured in changes between days and hours. Climate is measured in changes between months and years. So during the 11,000 years before the Industrial Revolution, the average global temperature was stable at around 14 degrees C. Since the Industrial Revolution, through changes to land use, so deforestation, and also the burning of fossil fuels, the average temperature of the planet has risen by around 1.1 degrees C. So we're already seeing changes to our climate in the UK. In a high emissions scenario, it's expected that the UK will experience warmer and wetter winters, hotter and drier summers, and more frequent and intense weather extremes. By 2070, the Met Office project that winters will be between 1 and 4.5 degrees warmer and up to 30% wetter, and also that summers will be between 1 and 6 degrees warmer and up to 60% drier. So there's three main environmental impacts that could happen across the UK. One is the increased likelihood of flooding, the second an increased likelihood of droughts, and the third an increased likelihood of heat waves. All of these have direct physical implications, but also some wide-reaching implications too. So we may see crop failures, we may see increased ill health. There may be increased global migration, both from people having to move away from physical environmental events, but also from a potential increase in global conflict. We're also likely to see increased costs of goods and services. This is from if a product is unable to be made in a certain location due to an environmental impact. It may have to relocate, and any reduced supply across the world could increase global prices. We may see people experiencing a decrease in well-being. We may need to put in extensive adaptation works to our buildings and our infrastructure, both new and existing works. There may be a reduction in biodiversity. We may also see excess early deaths, and we also may see property or infrastructure damage from flooding events. So we're already seeing climate impacts across Peterborough. So in July of 2022, the record temperature of 39.9 degrees Celsius was recorded at the Met Office weather station nearest to Peterborough. We've also seen several flooding events across the last few years, so notable ones in December 2020, July 2021 and October 2022. In August of 2022, 8 areas across England were declared to be in drought. So why are global temperatures rising? So this is down to our emissions of greenhouse gases, and that causes global temperatures to rise. So there are 4 main greenhouse gases. These are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and F gases. So solar energy from the sun is reflected from the Earth's surface. Greenhouse gases trap some of this solar energy in the Earth's atmosphere. And since the Industrial Revolution, humans have been releasing increasing amounts of greenhouse gases, and therefore more heat is trapped, and this causes global temperatures to rise. So I mentioned there's 4 main types of greenhouse gas. We usually report greenhouse gas emissions in carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's just a quick way to be able to report the emissions of an activity with a single unit. So instead of saying this activity releases this amount of carbon dioxide and this amount of methane, instead we report it as a carbon dioxide equivalent or CO2e value that just allows us to report in a single unit. So what can we do? The Paris Agreement was set up in 2015. Almost every country in the world promised to cut down on their greenhouse gas emissions with an overall aim to try to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Failing to do that, they would commit to global temperatures not reaching above 2 degrees Celsius. In June 2019, the UK became the world's first major economy to pass a law committing the country to a target of net zero, and this was by 2050. In Peterborough City Council declared a climate emergency in 2019. The council committed to becoming a net zero carbon organisation by 2030, and also to supporting Peterborough to become a net zero carbon city. So the wording on this second one is important. So obviously for Peterborough to become a net zero carbon city, we will need all of our residents, businesses, local organisations, community groups and schools to participate in this journey. But the council are committed to supporting these groups along the decarbonisation pathway. So what is net zero? So net zero is the state of a country, a city, an organisation or an individual where they are capturing as much carbon emissions as they are emitting. So you can capture carbon via a couple of different ways. The first is kind of natural, so mainly by tree planting. But just to note that tree planting is not guaranteed carbon capture. If that tree burns or rots, it can then release carbon into the atmosphere. The second way is to capture carbon via a physical or chemical process. But again, just to note that we're not in the situation currently where we're able to capture all of the emissions coming out of, say, a power plant. And so the real challenge for reaching net zero is to be able to reduce our emissions as much as possible. So that is the challenge that we need to rise to as a city. So we're going to move on to talking about Peterborough's annual emissions. So in 2021, Peterborough emitted around 1.3 megatons of CO2e in that year. That equates to around 5.9 tonnes of CO2e per resident, which is around about the UK national average. So this comes from various different sectors, and we'll be going into more detail about where these emissions come from and what we can do to reduce these. So 50% of Peterborough's emissions comes from our buildings. So that's the heating we use in our buildings and the electricity we use in our buildings. 39% of our emissions comes from transport. 6% of emissions comes from industry. 2% of emissions come from energy losses. 2% of emissions come from land use, and 1% of emissions come from waste. In addition to this, Peterborough is also responsible for the goods and services that are used within the city but are produced elsewhere. So if a product is made in Cambridge, the emissions that go into making that product will be counted within Cambridge's area. However, the product is used within Peterborough. And that's the same for if the product is produced abroad as well. There are a number of co-benefits that we should consider when we look at the prospect of taking on climate action. Many of the projects or schemes that could be proposed to tackle climate change come with a number of other benefits. These benefits can include health, adaptation to future climate events, improved jobs market. They can include improvements to biodiversity. They may involve savings to residents. This could be, for example, if you put insulation in your home, your energy bills will reduce. They can promote a sense of community, and they could also help public finances. So this could be income or savings for the council, but also if health is improved, there can be savings to organisations like the NHS. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of those co-benefits in more detail. So some facts about the health across Peterborough. 35% of adults in Peterborough are inactive. That means that they exercise less than 30 minutes each week. 13% of adults in Peterborough are fairly active, which means they exercise between 30 and 149 minutes each week, which is below the recommended amount of 150 minutes. So any actions which include promotion of active travel, so walking or cycling, could benefit both the climate and also improve health across Peterborough. Between 28,000 and 36,000 deaths are caused to human man-made air pollution each year. That's in the UK. In the coldest 25% of housing, in comparison to the warmest 25% of housing, there are almost 3 times as many excess winter deaths. And mental health is impacted by access to green spaces, exercise, and stress, and that could be stress owing to weather events, finances, and global events. Also, mental health can be impacted by climate anxiety. So if you are feeling anxious by any of the topics that are spoken about today, then there are lots of resources online that you can find to be able to support you in that experience. And just to talk about jobs, so in 2021, there was a 4.7% unemployment across Peterborough. So any climate action which supports local jobs can help reduce that amount of unemployment. Another thing to mention is equality. So climate change is likely to affect some people more than others. And also actions to tackle climate change may differently affect different people. So all residents should be able to participate in decarbonisation actions, and we should be considering things such as poverty, gender, age, health and mobility. Also, we don't just need to look at it from a fair and equal point of view, but we also need to make sure that everyone is able to lower their own carbon emissions. If we select a pathway in which only certain people in our communities can decarbonise their emissions, then we won't reach our goal of net zero. So we need to make sure that everyone can engage with new behaviours and technologies across the city. So we're going to go on to looking at each theme in more detail, exploring some of the research that guides us with what we need to achieve, and then explore some options for how we may reach net zero for each theme. So we're going to start with buildings and where we live. So in 2020, across the city, we created 640,700 tonnes of CO2e from our buildings. So this is from our heating and our electricity use. So to reduce building emissions, we need to reduce our heating and electricity use and switch to low carbon renewable sources of heating and electricity. A local area energy plan has been created for Peterborough. It estimates the amount of retrofitting needed in buildings and the amount of fossil fuel heating systems that need to transition to low carbon options. Around 67% of homes will require a retrofit and energy efficiency upgrade. These can be of two types, either a basic retrofit, that's typically cavity wall insulation or loft insulation. That's classified as basic because it takes less time to achieve and comes at a lower price point. Some properties will require a deep retrofit. In these cases, these are usually solid wall insulation. So if your property doesn't have a cavity wall, then you'll either need to install external or internal wall insulation, and also double glazing comes under that category of deep retrofit too. So we also know we need to transition across to low carbon heating. So 90% of our buildings currently use gas, oil or LPG for their heating source, with only 5% currently using a low carbon heating source. And we need to transition until that number reaches 100%. So there are a few technologies you may have heard of. The first I'm going to talk about is air source heat pump. So heat from the air is exchanged into a heat pump, and that results in hot water passing to your radiators. An air source heat pump looks a little bit like an air conditioning unit on the outside of your home. Standard air source heat pumps operate at lower temperatures than a gas boiler, so you may need a larger radiator to heat up your house to the same temperature. And these air source heat pumps are powered by electricity. Ground source heat pumps are fairly similar, except the heat is exchanged from the ground. This will require extensive pipework to be laid underground, and therefore it's not likely to be suitable for a domestic house, but is also powered by electricity. You may also have heard of hydrogen boilers. These are not currently available, but hydrogen may be able to be used as a fuel source in the future. It's likely not to be available until around 2035, and also something to consider is that the hydrogen source may be prioritised for commercial uses that we can't switch to an electric fuel source. Next is district heat networks. So a district heat network uses a central heat source to heat water, and that water is then distributed to properties via underground pipework. So for some areas in the city, the most cost-effective heating system might be district heating, which is shown in the map here. And the coloured areas, the green and blue, are the areas which are likely to be suited to district heat networks. And you can see these are in the populated areas around the city centre. For more rural areas, it's unlikely that district heat networks are going to be suitable, as the cost of the pipework to get between properties is likely to be too expensive. So just to quickly run through some of the technologies we've just spoken about, hydrogen boilers are not yet available. A ground source heat pump may cost around £15,000 to £20,000, and also you need large ground excavation works to lay the underground pipework. A district heat network, again, is not available yet, but may become available in some areas of the city. Little installation is needed in the home, as most of the work is done in a central location. You then have low temperature air source heat pumps. These are typically going to cost around £9,000 to £11,000. Installation is likely to take around 3 to 8 days, as you'll likely need to replace the radiators in your home. A high temperature air source heat pump, you'll likely not need to replace the radiators, but the system is less efficient to run than a low temperature air source heat pump, and it also comes with a higher upfront costs. So you've got raised prices on both sides. The local area energy plan estimates that Peterborough will need around 80,000 air source heat pumps in homes and around 16,000 homes connected to district heat networks. So there has been some scepticism around whether heat pumps are suitable for every home type. And because of this, government commissioned a study to try to understand what houses are suitable for heat pumps. In the study, heat pumps were installed in 742 houses of various different types in multiple locations across England and Scotland, and all house types were found to be suitable for the installation of heat pump. So we've spoken about how we may be able to retrofit existing buildings to improve their energy efficiency and also switch across to low carbon heating. But we can also look at planning policy to make sure that our new builds are of low carbon. So some potential options that could be considered in planning policy are a requirement for buildings to be low carbon when they're being used, so making sure they have low carbon heating and electricity. Requiring construction methods and materials to be low carbon. Requiring buildings to be well adapted to a changing climate, such as making sure they're adapted to heat waves and flooding. Requiring developments to consider reduced travel emissions for those building users. This may be things such as trying to embed public transport, walking or cycling, by making sure that there are short distances from homes to the various amenities that people need every day. We could consider establishing an offset payment scheme for emissions that can't be reduced on site, and also a requirement for a connection to low carbon energy infrastructure, such as heating or electricity. So I now invite you to have a think about how you may reduce building emissions. So there are a few prompts here to have a think about. If you're going through this exercise in a group, you might want to pause the video and have a quick discussion on how you think the city should decarbonise its buildings. If you're doing this alone, you may want to pause and have a think, and then we'll move on to the following section, which we're going to discuss transport. So, moving on to transport. So how do we reduce the emissions from the way we travel? In 2020, Peterborough as a city emitted around 500,000 tonnes of CO2e. To reduce transport emissions, we need to reduce vehicle travel, such as by car, lorry and plane. We need to increase travel by public transport, by walking and cycling, and also potentially switch to a low carbon fuel when a vehicle is used. Currently, fewer than 10% of cars are low carbon. This means electric or plug-in hybrid cars. And it is likely we'll be in a situation that by 2040, around 72% of vehicles will be low carbon. And this is because of two main policies. One is the national ban of the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030. And the second is the ban on the sale of new hybrid cars from 2035. And because of these policies, we're likely to see the reduction in petrol and diesel cars and they be phased out of use, and that resulting in 72% of cars being low carbon by 2040. And because of this, the local area energy plan estimates that by 2040, there will be around 80,000 electric vehicles owned in the city, and that will mean that we will likely need 50,000 household electric vehicle charging points. If a property has off-street parking, it's deemed likely that the householder will install an electric vehicle charging point at their home. If not, then they'll likely need to use an alternative solution. The Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority established the Independent Commission on Climate Change. It recommends that the region commits to trying to achieve a 15% reduction in car mileage by 2030. So looking at alternative methods of travel, there's been some research done that shows that for journeys less than 5 kilometres, residents in Peterborough were more likely to cycle than the average across England. So that's 9% rather than 5% nationally. Residents were less likely to walk than average across England, 16% compared to 24%, and residents were more likely to travel by car, either as a driver or as a passenger, than across England, so 63% compared to 56%. And so we're going to move on now to some possible ways to lower emissions. So we're going to talk now about electric vehicle charging points. And there are several different speeds of charger, slow, fast and rapid, and they differ in the time that it takes to charge a car from an empty battery to a full battery. So a slow charger would take around 11 hours for a typical car. A fast would take around 6 hours, and a rapid would take around 1 hour. And this is seen across the country, but operators typically charge different amounts depending on the speed of the charger. So as I mentioned, for those people with off-street parking, it's expected that they'll do the majority of their charging at home. For those without off-street parking, an alternative solution may need to be found. So options here include charging a vehicle by trailing a cable from the home across the pavement to a parked car. However, this may be a trip hazard and also may reduce access for those with mobility difficulties. The person trailing a cable across the pavement would be liable for any trips, and Peterborough City Council does not currently support this solution. There are trials by other local authorities looking into installing gullies from homes to the road, which would allow cables to be laid across the pavement safely. There is no guarantee, however, that a driver would be able to park directly outside of their home and therefore be able to reach the cable from their property to where the car is parked. Charging points may be placed on the road. And depending on the demand for charging in a specific area, it's likely that the number of charging points per road would vary. An alternative solution is car park charging. So that being multiple charging points could be placed in a single location, such as a car park. These car parks could be owned by the council, they could be owned by a commercial car park operator, or a business or a local community centre. A further way to reduce emissions from transport is improving the uptake of cycling. So some things that could be considered are building segregated cycle paths. Segregated cycle paths are separated from cars by a physical barrier, such as by a curb or a bollard. Bicycle maintenance schemes can also operate, such as Dr. Bike, And this includes a full check of bicycles and minor on-the-day repairs. And there is also a scheme called School Streets. And this is where a school signs up to the scheme and the street outside the school is closed at the start and the end of the school day. And this makes the area safer to walk and cycle and also improves air quality. So we'll move on to now talking about electric scooters. So currently the use of electric scooters is not legal and they can only be used in hire schemes which have been authorised by government. There has, however, been an indication by government that this may change. And just some information on the speed restrictions on e-scooters. So in current trials, they can travel up to 15.5 miles per hour. So we can also look at possible ways to improve the bus service. Often bus services use a centre point model where buses travel into the city centre. An orbital service would allow a passenger to travel to a neighbouring location without travelling into the city centre. And depending on the route, this may save time. But of course, operation of this would need to consider passenger demand. We also have demand responsive transport. This is usually in operation when demand is too low to operate a standard route. And demand responsive transport includes things such as dial-a-ride services, flexible bus routes that don't necessarily take the same route each time, and they may use buses, minibuses, or taxis. Another thing to consider is potentially multiple operator tickets. So that would be a single ticket that you can use with multiple operators. So moving on now to a couple of larger schemes. So there are several UK cities which have clean air zones. Vehicles that don't meet the low emission criteria must pay a fee to enter the zone. The types of vehicles it applies to varies between city. So some cities include buses, coaches, some include taxis and lorries, and some include vans, minibuses, cars and motorcycles. The zone area is unlikely to cover the whole city, but it may be changed over time to expand. And you can also allow exemptions to some groups of drivers so they don't have to pay the fee. Another scheme is the workplace parking levy. Currently, Nottingham is the only UK scheme running. And in this scheme, workplaces with over 10 parking spaces have to pay an annual fee per parking space, and these funds are ring-fenced to improving public transport around the city. Some further things to consider are car clubs. So this is where a person rents a car for a short amount of time, so typically for a number of hours, and that reduces the need to own a car. Lift sharing schemes match people taking similar journeys, and this could be on a regular or a one-off basis, so that journey is shared between multiple people. Reducing last mile emissions from deliveries could be possible by establishing locker sites, which can be used to drop parcels at, and this reduces the emissions from small vans dropping off deliveries at individual houses. And we could also look at altering the taxi licensing rules to help speed up the transition to electric vehicles. So again, we moved on to some discussion prompts. So the overall topic here is how would you reduce transport emissions? If you're watching this video with others, then you may wish to pause the video to have a discussion. So now we're moving on to discussing the emissions from our purchases. So emissions from what we purchase are difficult to calculate. Generally, to reduce emissions from purchases, we need to reduce what we purchase and choose less carbon-intensive purchases. So an example of guidance around reducing emissions from our purchases is that the Climate Change Committee recommends a 35% reduction in all meat and dairy by 2050. The Climate Change Committee is an independent statutory body established under the Climate Change Act 2008, and the purpose of it is to advise the UK and devolved governments on emissions targets. So there are several ways to reduce food emissions: reducing food mileage, eating food produced in season, and eating less carbon-intensive types of food. Air transport creates around 10 times more emissions than transport by road, and around 50 times more emissions than shipping. Transport by aeroplane is usually only used for produce that would not survive the longer shipping times, and this is for foods such as berries. So eating seasonally, for example, only eating berries in the summer when they can be harvested in the UK, and eating other fruits like apples in the autumn and winter can help to reduce food mileage. So if a food is produced out of season but locally, it may be that a heated greenhouse is being used, and this will mean that carbon emissions will be high. Meat and dairy generally have high carbon intensity, with beef being amongst the highest carbon emitting foods. This is largely due to methane production by cows. Switching across to a vegetarian or vegan diet and reducing consumption of meat and dairy will really help to reduce food emissions, as recommended by the Committee on Climate Change. So we move now on to emissions from what we waste. So across Peterborough, we emit around 14,000 tonnes of CO2e a year. So to reduce waste emissions, we need to reduce what we throw away, so products don't need to be remade, and so that greenhouse gases are not emitted when products break down. So the waste hierarchy should be used to reduce waste. The number one priority should be to prevent items from being made, then to reuse items, then to recycle items, then to recover items, and finally, the last resort should be to dispose of an item. So I'm going to talk here about 3 different schemes, and using these various refill schemes can help to reduce the single-use materials used when disposable versions are used instead. So for water refill stations, these are typically restaurants and cafes who allow you to refill your water bottle rather than purchasing a single-use plastic bottle of water. There are also reusable cup schemes, typically cafes who incentivise you to use a reusable cup rather than a takeaway disposable version. And then there are refill shops where you purchase the product you're intending to purchase, but without the disposable single-use packaging. So in this case, you'd purchase a liquid soap in a reusable container. We're going to move on again to some discussion prompts around how you would reduce emissions from purchases and waste. So if you're watching a video with others, then please pause the video and have a discussion. So we're moving on now to talk about land use emissions. So across Peterborough in 2020, we emitted around 20,000 tonnes of CO2e. So to reduce emissions from land use, we need to capture more carbon and adopt less carbon-intensive land practices. When a tree grows, it turns carbon dioxide into solid carbon in the trunks and roots, and this removes or captures carbon from the atmosphere. So planting trees is a positive step. However, the real impact of planting trees happens when the tree is around 50 to 100 years old. So a 50-year-old woodland can capture around 300 to 400 tonnes of CO2e per hectare a year. And this increases for a 100-year-old woodland, being able to capture around 400 to 600 tonnes of CO2e per hectare a year. So obviously planting a sapling tomorrow is great, but the real benefits of carbon capture come in the future. So the highest cost of tree planting is the ongoing care, including watering, and this limits the amount of tree planting that can occur. So there are schemes where a person, a community group, or an organisation can sign up to looking after a tree or a number of trees in a local area, committing to watering and taking care of that tree. So it has the highest chance of growing successfully. So we're going to move on to talking about peat now. Some areas of Peterborough contain peat soil. Peat has the ability to capture significant amounts of carbon. However, if in an unhealthy or a dried state, it can release carbon into the atmosphere. Cambridgeshire has a large amount of wasted peatland, which are emitting carbon. It's not known the extent of how much carbon is being or has been emitted. The Committee on Climate Change recommends that peat extraction is stopped and nearly 80% of the UK's peatlands are restored to their natural state. So moving on now to talk about energy. So emissions from energy generation are calculated and reported in the area that the energy is used, i.e. the electricity generated in Peterborough is reported at the national level rather than the local level, and that ensures that emissions are not counted twice, as it's already been attributed to Peterborough based on our energy usage. So activities to lower energy emissions, such as installing renewable electricity generation, result in lower buildings emissions. However, we do have some data on energy losses. So around 28,000 tonnes of CO2e are emitted through our energy losses. And these energy losses come from unintentional leaks from industrial plants and pipes. Local area energy plan explored the city's electricity demand, and because of the transition to electrical heating and electrical vehicles, it's estimated that Peterborough will require 47% more electricity by 2040. We are also like to see a decarbonisation of the national grid. The national grid is expected to decarbonise over time due to more renewable electricity being available and it relying less on fossil fuels. If Peterborough wants to decarbonise faster than the national grid, then more renewable electricity generation will be needed. To reduce emissions from energy, we need to increase the amount of renewable electricity generated. So some possible ways to lower emissions are installing rooftop solar panels, ground-mounted solar panels, and onshore wind turbines. Currently, large-scale wind generation is not possible within Peterborough. For this to become an option, it would need to be included in the local planning policy, and there would need to be local support for a scheme. There are some wind generation schemes in the country where residents in a local postcode district can get 20 to 50% discount on electricity, depending on what's being generated at the time. So there may be some financial benefits to local residents for supporting a local wind generation scheme. So moving on now to look at industry. And as a city, in a year, we produce 75,000 tonnes of CO2e. So these are the non-energy related emissions from industrial processes. So greenhouse gases that are released directly from an industrial process. So decisions are likely to involve a small number of stakeholders, so therefore they've not been considered in this workshop. So we're going to talk about the final section here, which is funding options. So we've previously spoken about developer payments. So as a reminder, these could be introduced for a building developer to pay a fee for any carbon emissions that they can't remove from their building development. We've also spoken about the workplace parking levy and the clean air zone. A further thing to consider is community municipal bonds So this is when private investment is raised for a specific project with an agreed financial payback. These projects must make a profit, such as electricity generation, to be able to guarantee that financial payback. A further option might be crowdsource funding, and this is where private investment is raised for a specified project, but perhaps without any financial payback. So projects are likely to have other benefits to the investor, such as the creation of a woodland that they can visit. So we've got a final set of discussion prompts here, and I'd invite you to have a think about how you would reduce emissions from land use and energy, and also how you may fund carbon reduction projects. So again, if you are undertaking this workshop in a group, then please pause the video and have a discussion. So looking ahead to what the council will do next, I'm shortly going to be asking you to complete some feedback. We really want to hear your views on how the city should decarbonise. So that public engagement exercise is due to close mid-February. The council will then collate this feedback and will publish the results so that others around the city can use the insight collected here to inform any of their decarbonisation plans. We will then develop our draft decarbonisation action plan for the city, and we'll release the draft action plan for consultation. So that will be available for residents, businesses and organisations to comment on. Now we come on to invite you to have your say. Thank you for joining us on this workshop. On it, we've explored some of the potential options to decarbonise the city, and now we're really interested to hear which ones you support and which policies and which actions you would like to see undertaken in the city to help us transition to net zero. Some of these actions may be achievable by Peterborough City Council. Some of them may be ideas that we share with other national, regional or local organisations. If you could complete this feedback by the 13th of February, that would be much appreciated. We'll then begin collating this information. The form begins with a number of questions on demographics. The council intend to use this to understand if we've engaged with a representative cohort of our communities. You don't have to answer any of these questions should you not wish to. So the final thing to say is thank you for joining us on this workshop and thank you for sharing your views.